break. Hold on 7, this is Route 1, troops in contact. Coordinates to follow.
In 1968, Israeli paratroopers conducted a raid on Beirut airport in Lebanon as part of a larger campaign to incapacitate Palestinian militias. French President Charles de Gaulle, angered by Israel's actions and hoping to maintain healthy relations with a former French colony, issued a full arms embargo on Israel in 1969. This embargo ensures that any military procurement agreements between Israel and France could not be fulfilled. 5 Sa'ar-class missile boats had been ordered from France and paid for by the Israeli Navy. These boats, now officially the property of Israel, were being withheld as part of the embargo. With ongoing conflicts with its neighbours, the Israeli Navy was very keen to take delivery of these valuable naval assets to conduct patrols in the Mediterranean. On the 24th of December 1969, members of the Israeli Navy would carry out an outrageous operation of deceit to extract the missile boats from the French port of Cherbourg on the English Channel. During the first months of the embargo, several high-ranking French officials assured the Israeli Ministry of Defense that the embargo was a temporary measure. With de Gaulle's retirement and the appointment of Georges Pompidou as his replacement, hope for the embargo's lifting was renewed. However, as time passed, the embargo would continue to remain in place, with no meaningful political deliberation for its removal. Losing hope in a diplomatic solution, Israeli naval officers now began to discuss ways around the embargo, including selling the boats to another state for them to be repurchased from them. Although plausible, Israel sought not to damage Franco-Israeli relations any further. Nonetheless, France had violated its binding contracts in keeping these boats in Cherbourg. With Israel bogged down in the so-called War of Attrition, the potential for a more conventional conflict grew, increasing Israel's need for the boats. In Cherbourg, the boats were left unmonitored and unguarded. With this knowledge, retired Rear Admiral Limon, head of Israel's defense mission in Paris, began to devise a commando operation to steal their own boats and sail them away using crews flown from Israel. However, the illegal nature of this operation forced then Prime Minister Golda Meir to withhold consent, affirming that no illegal activity was to take place. Limon, unfazed, forged onwards, famously saying, "The distinction between legal and illegal may be no wider than a lawyer's comma. In the right circumstances, it may be wide enough to drive a missile boat squadron through." Interestingly, Limon was approached by a journalist who passed on a secret message from Alexandre Sanguinetti, chairman of the National Defense Committee of the French Assembly, asking, "Why don't the Israelis just get their boats and go?" This inspires Limon to push onwards, knowing that divisions exist within the French government and that they can be exploited. In Cherbourg, 3 of the 5 boats were now completed and in the water, with the remaining 2 due soon. Any operation would have to take place after the final boat had been put to sea. This abundance of time allowed Limon to focus his concerns more on the getaway than the plan to grab the boats itself. The journey from Cherbourg to Haifa was over 3,000 miles, meaning the vessels would require 2 refuels, one near Gibraltar and another near Malta. Navy Commander Moshe Tabak, one of the several Israeli officers stationed in Cherbourg to oversee the construction of the boats, floated the idea of loading and carrying large inflatable rubber fuel tanks to extend the small vessel's range. This idea would be rejected out of fears that these rubber tanks would turn the boats into powder kegs at the risk of exploding. With an apparent lack of options, Limon now explored the option of selling the boats once more, this time to a civilian entity, one which would then ferry the vessels to Israel and then sell them back to them. This plan had 2 issues. Limon would have to find a willing company and a suitable civilian reason for said company to purchase the boats, as all defense-related sales required approval from the French authorities. Fortunately for Limon, with the aid of an old friend, Mila Brenner, a retired Navy commander and now owner of Israeli-based Maritime Fruit Carriers Company, he quickly found both. Brenner's acquaintance, the director of Norwegian boat builder Akkers Mekaniske Verksted, was a man named Martin Siem. He would create a front company called Starboat, which would publicly claim to be a new company delivering supplies and personnel to and from North Sea oil rigs. he would be in on the plan. For Siem, the excitement of secretive deception takes him back to the days of fighting the German occupation in Norway with the Norwegian resistance. On the 30th of October, Limon informed his superiors in Tel Aviv of his broad idea, notifying them that the opportune moment for any potential plan was Christmas Eve, to reduce the likelihood of discovery, and to ensure that, if they were discovered, large portions of the French bureaucracy were away from work celebrating Christmas. The answer from Tel Aviv remained no. Limon continued to develop his idea anyway. Realistically, for any plan to work, he knew that he needed the support of Félix Amiot, director of the boat's manufacturer, Construction Mécanique de Normandie. Luckily for Limon, having long established a relationship with Amiot, he knew that he was eager to fulfill his contractual obligations and see the ships transported to their rightful owners, simply as a matter of honour. With this, Limon drafted a letter to be sent by Martin Siem, the director of the new Starboat Company, to Félix Amiot. The letter explained that Siem, having created a front company Starboat, would purchase the boats from Amiot and then sail them to Israel. Siem, like Amiot, was enthusiastic to support this plan. With his idea coming together with more detail, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan offered his support. All that remained was the permission of Prime Minister Golda Meir. Back in France, Amiot contacted the Director of International Affairs for the Ministerial Delegation of Armaments, General Louis Bont. He informed General Bont of Starboat's offer to purchase the boats for civilian purposes. In turn, General Bont passed the offer of purchase on to Limon, blissfully unaware that Limon was the mastermind of the entire deceit. General Bont informed Limon that France was willing to consider the offer, pending Israel waiving its rights to the boats and accepting a refund in return. Limon responded defensively. "These boats are ours, we've paid for them and we need them," emphasizing the importance and thus the unwillingness of Israel to give up these boats. Despite being the engineer of the offer, any eagerness on his part to accept would potentially raise suspicion of Israeli involvement in the deal. Here, Limon successfully convinced General Bont and by extension the French authorities to press for this deal rather than Israel, as it absolved the French of a lengthy legal headache. On the 18th of November, the matter was raised before the Inter-Ministerial Committee on Arms Exports, chaired by General Bernard Gezel. Here, advocates for the deal inferred that the Norwegian Navy was covertly procuring the boats via Starboat. As France and Norway were NATO allies, this was accepted, and the deal passed with ease, even with one late addition, a non-re-exportation clause. Despite this deal appearing questionable to many, none bothered to investigate Starboat or question why warships would be required for the prescribed tasks. Yet, to little surprise, many French officials simply turned an eye, winked, or saw it as an opportunity to spite Defense Minister Michel Debré for his advocacy of the largely disliked embargo. This is perfectly exemplified during a meeting between Amiot's lawyers and Jacques Marty, head of the customs division responsible for boat exports. Marty approved the deal, once Amiot's lawyers willingly revealed its true nature. During the meeting, Marty asked, "Norway, eh? These boats are heading for Israel, aren't they?" "Yes," Amiot's lawyers replied. "In that case, I'll sign," continued Marty. Marty passed the deal as, like many of his countrymen, he disapproved of the arms embargo placed on Israel. Back in Israel, with the aid of Zim Integrated Shipping Services Limited, a publicly held Israeli cargo shipping company, 2 merchant ships were readied to allow for the simultaneous refueling of 5 boats at 2 locations during their journey, Malta and Gibraltar. Meanwhile, members of the Israeli Navy were flown to France where they were to be embedded amongst Israeli families or stationed below decks on the boats themselves, ready for the operation to come. One such group of Israelis landed in Paris and were stopped by a customs officer who questioned their backgrounds. "What kind of group are you?" the officer asked. "Students," a sailor replied. In a quick rebuttal, the officer asked in Hebrew, "Come off it, are you military?" Another sailor replied, "No, why do you ask?" "Because the passports are numbered consecutively, you've all got fresh haircuts, and you're all wearing the same kind of jackets. a mistake Mossad would not have made were it involved. At first, the group thought they had been compromised, only for the customs officer to say, "Take it easy, you've done nothing illegal." And with that, the sailors were allowed to go. By the 16th of December, all 5 boats were afloat, fully laden with fuel. With this came the risk of alerting French authorities, as the waterline was perceptibly high on the hulls due to the additional fuel. Remedying this, the boats were taken for supposed sea testing every day to justify the need for extra fuel. Several days passed and another problem manifested. Noise complaints flooded the local constabulary because of the dockside generators. If one generator were to cause disruption, then the roar of 5 boats simultaneously sailing on Christmas Eve certainly would. On the 22nd of December, Limon, CM and Amiot signed a series of agreements which would complete the deceit of the French government. The first agreement formally cancelled the original contract with which Israel had initially purchased the boats. The second agreement formally confirmed the sale of the boats from the boat manufacturer, Amiot, to CM's Starboat at the very same price. Similar agreements outlined that due to time restrictions, Norwegian crews could not be trained in time, so their Israeli counterparts would deliver the boats to Norway. A further agreement stipulated that Starboat would refund the costs of the boats to Israel directly, removing Amiot from the equation and providing him with the protection from potential prosecution for illegally transferring money abroad if the fictitious nature of the deal were uncovered. Martin CM, under the direction of Limon, now signed a contract with a longtime friend, Mordechai Friedman, the head of Netivai Neft, an Israeli oil exploration company secretly under instruction by the Israeli government. This contract stipulated that Starboat would immediately lease the boats to Netivai Neft for 3 years, with the option to purchase the boats outright within the first 3 months. And so, these publicly disclosed contracts stated that the boats would be sold to a Norwegian firm named Starboat, where they would then be leased onto a civilian oil exploration company, with the option for that company to purchase the boats outright. It was this version of events that had been approved by the French government. However, Limon now created a new round of contracts which were to remain private and undisclosed publicly, but supersede the publicly disclosed contracts the French government had approved of. Firstly, Limon freed CM's Starboat of all contractual obligations to buy the boats. He then nullified the agreement with Amiot to cancel the order. The nullification of the agreements allowed Israel to retain ownership of the boats. Also covertly, CM notified Netivai Neft that the boats were now property of Israel, not Starboat, and therefore the contract to lease them from Starboat was now void. And so, the result was that the publicly disclosed contracts as approved by the French government showed that the boats would soon leave Cherbourg, having been sold to Starboat, for leasing on to Netivai Neft. Privately, however, Limon had then cancelled all of these contracts, keeping the boat's ownership with Israel, allowing them to sail out of Cherbourg on Christmas Eve and, unbeknownst to France, sail to Israel, not Norway. With approval for the deception now granted by Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, the operation was a go. On the 24th of December, as they prepared to launch, an early evening weather forecast revealed a force 9 gale, destined to scupper passage through the channel. Throughout the night, Israeli officers listened attentively to weather reports, hoping for a window. At 2 a.m. they found one, and in the early morning darkness, the boat sailed out of Cherbourg harbour into dangerous seas, moving down the English Channel into the Bay of Biscay. Here, conditions worsened. The boat continued southwest, around Cape St. Vincent on the southwest tip of Portugal, where they reached their first refuelling stop. At around the same time, French news agencies had become aware that the boats had left Cherbourg. A news helicopter was flown out into the North Sea to locate the boats, as they should be en route to Norway, but the boats were nowhere to be seen. With this, official phones rang wildly as journalists scurried to gather the details of what was transpiring. French authorities either ignored these calls or gave them the official line, affirming that the boats were en route to a Norwegian firm as part of a routine commercial transaction. This wouldn't last for long. Whilst the boats were still refuelling off the Portuguese coast, the Norwegian ambassador to Paris issued a statement that Starboat was an improperly registered company and did not appear on the standard registries of Norwegian firms. An hour later, the Norwegian government confirmed that the boats themselves had not been registered in Norway. In the late afternoon on the 27th of December, as the force began to transit the Strait of Gibraltar, they received a signal light from a British monitoring installation atop the Rock of Gibraltar, flashing a routine query, "What ship?" The Israelis did not reply. A Royal Navy helicopter circled overhead, before briefly moving onward, likely identifying the force of Israeli boats and relaying this back. After 15 minutes, another signal arrived, this time reading in French, "Bon voyage," a tip of the cap from a British commander who had figured out what was going on. The Israeli commander would later write, "When the British admiral was informed that 5 boats were passing without offering identification, he must have known it was us. It took him 15 minutes to get his staff together to raise a toast to us for screwing the French." Shortly after, the BBC reported that a Greek vessel transiting the Straits had reported the 5 unidentified vessels. In France, Defense Minister Michel Debré, furious at the Israelis' deceit and the presentation of the French government as a laughingstock, sought to intercept and sink the boats by air and sea. This, however, was rejected by the French Prime Minister. After many further arduous hours in the small vessels sailing through the Mediterranean, east of Crete, they were joined by a formation of Israeli Phantoms. They were now on the home stretch. At great speed and low altitude, the aircraft flew over the boats, wings wagging in greeting. Finally, after several days sailing in the small vessels, the boats of Cherbourg arrived into the Israeli port of Kishon to great cheers and press coverage. The French reaction was minimal, great enough to appease the Arab world who these boats could now be used against, but small enough to save face internationally. The French population would not share the outrage of their government. Some 3/4 would support the Israeli getaway, not only because of their support for Israel, but also because it showed the French government to be criminally inept. Regardless, the operation itself proved to the world that Israel, in pursuit of national defense, was willing to do what it must, regardless of whether its methods were dubious or not. The boats themselves would prove to revolutionize naval warfare, playing a crucial role in the Yom Kippur War, specifically at the Battle of Latakia, where they would wreak havoc on the Syrian navy.